Parsha's bow. Okay, we're not going to use much of the Chumash inside. Okay, so welcome. Thank you everybody for coming. Parsha, the inside story. So, what's the inside story of this week's Parsha? And what are we trying to do? So hopefully we'll start a series going into every Parsha, and we'll detail a little bit of the inside story. What's the inside story? So the Chumash is sort of a law. It's a list of stories and laws. And what I'll try to focus on is a little bit behind the laws. What's the fundamentals of Judaism that are written within these laws? The specific focus on faith, practice, and tradition. So today we'll start with faith. One of the critical components of faith is the idea of hashgacha pratis or hashgacha klalos. What does that mean? Hashgacha means that God acts with divine providence. That means that the world is run in a certain fashion, and God acts within the world. He performs miracles. And we'll try to explore more of that. What does that mean, he performs miracles? How often does he perform miracles? Are miracles is everything a miracle? Or what exactly does that mean? So let's begin. So a brief summary of this week's Parsha. We learn about the 10 Makos. The last 3 plagues that the Egyptians were smitten with are in this week's Parsha. God smites the Egyptians with Arba, Choshech, and Makas Becharis, with locusts, with darkness, and with the plague of killing of the firstborn. Now, when God kills the firstborn, so he tells Moshe Rabbeinu to tell the Jewish people to go bring a carbon Pesach, a Pesach sacrifice, and cover your doors with a little bit of blood, and that will protect you, that when God unleashes the destroyer will know which house is not to kill by the merit of the sacrifice of the carbon Pesach. And sure enough, at midnight, a large percentage of the Egyptian population is smitten. God kills every firstborn, every head of household is also killed, and the Jews are protected. Of course, Paro is the only exception to that. Paro is both a head of household and a firstborn, but God spares him because God has other plans for him. So
it included the head of household
in addition to the firstborn. Yeah. So many houses had more than one person that was killed. Additionally, the Egyptians were known for their promiscuity, and very often their promiscuity was quite revealed that night, because the firstborn was not necessarily the one that you thought was the firstborn.
Being before indicative of the father, not the mother.
The Bechor was the Bechor of the father. Bechor of the father. So the father, so it's complicated. There's 2 types of Bechor. Typically, a Bechor is father. However, the rule of Pidyon Haben is an exception to that rule. Pidyon Haben goes by the mother.
And that's the only.
And Pidyon Haben is unique that if the mother miscarries, there's no Pidyon Haben. For example, I'm a Bechor, but my mother had a miscarriage before I was born. Therefore, I did not have Pidyon Haben, even though my father, neither my father nor my mother are Levium. In other words, I would have had a Pidyon Haben. Okay. Anyway, that is okay. So that was another interesting feature of Makas Becharis, of the killing of the firstborn. And of course, what happens? Paro runs around. He finds Moshe Rabbeinu. He tells Moshe Rabbeinu, "Go take the Jews out of Egypt tonight." And Moshe Rabbeinu says, "No. We're taking our time. We're not running away like prisoners in jailbreak. We're going to wait until the morning." And in the morning, when things are very clear and everybody understands we're not prisoners, we're going to leave at our pace. And sure enough, the morning comes and Paro chases them out. They leave in such a hurry that they made dough to presumably to make bread that morning. The dough they take on their backs, and it bakes in the desert sun. The dough never had a chance to rise, and that turned into what we call matzah.
Is there any complication of the theme of no, we're not going to hurry, we're going to wait, but I got to put the bread on my back because I'm in a hurry? They seem to counter each other.
Right. So the idea was that they weren't going to run around at night like a jailbreak, but Paro did chase them out. Paro was
time to ask the Egyptians for the treasures.
So the Egyptians were asked the treasures, I think a little previously. I think they were asked even before Makas Becheres. I think they were asked for the treasures.
And they gave them up.
Yeah, they asked purportedly to borrow them, and of course they kept them. Okay, and so that's the story of the parsha. Then at the end of the parsha, we conclude, we reiterate the laws of Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, which would later on be brought in the temple with a slightly different set of rules. And then we conclude with a mitzvah to remember. Remember everything that happens in this week's parsha. Remember about the 10 plagues, about Makas Becheres. Remember that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God saves us from the destroyer that night, and he kills the Egyptians and spares the Jews. And how do we remember that? We bind this message to our arms and between our eyes. We put on the mitzvah tefillah. And here is where we'll begin our discussion of Hashgacha. The Ramban points out that this is a theme in many, many commandments. The theme is, remember that I took you out of Egypt with miracles. Why is it so important? Why is it so important that we have so many commandments just to remind us of this theme? So Ramban points out that there were classically, in the introduction of idolatry and atheism, there were 3 paradigms. The first paradigm, and the Rambam will list additional variations. The first paradigm was that there was never a God, as I think it's can't remember which of the Greek philosophers it was. They said, what's underneath the world? So he said, the great God of Zeus. They said, and what's underneath him? The great turtle. And what's underneath the great turtle? It's turtles all the way down, right? The idea is that Olam Kadmon, the world has always existed. In philosophical terms, this is called infinite time. There never was a prime mover that created the world ex nihilo. The world never came into existence. That never happened. According to this paradigm of atheism, the world has always existed, and it never came to be. In the modern world, obviously, the redshift is a serious question on this paradigm, which is why even atheists today don't believe the world never had a moment of conception, as it were, a moment of creation. The atheists maybe will deny that God was the one who created the world, but it seems quite clear that the world, if the universe is expanding, there must have been a point of origin, and that's accepted scientific wisdom. The next group was a group of idolaters that said, no, there is a God, but he's gone off to do much bigger and better projects, and he's abandoned the world. In this paradigm, God is too lofty to even think about the world. He does all sorts of things that we have no way of perceiving, and he created a world, and now it's our job to run it on our own. So God neither perceives the world, nor is he involved in the world. And the third group says God knows the world, but God does not intercede. That means God created the world. You think of him as like a professional watchmaker. He wound up the watch and he lets it run. In philosophy, this is often called the watchmaker theory. Now, if it's true that God created a watch and spun it up and let it run, there is no culpability. There's no reward, and therefore there cannot be no punishment either, because God is not active in the world. Now, obviously, if God performs a miracle, such as we find in this week's Parsha, that's clear evidence that disproves all 3 paradigms, especially when this miracle was predicted by a prophet. What's the definition of prophecy? Definition of prophecy is that a man, human being, predicts an unlikely event, and that event comes to pass in a specific time frame. You don't have like an infinite time to make your predictions. It's got to be within a certain time limit, and it comes to pass, this unlikely event. This especially proves that God interacts with the world, and he messages with us. We find in Moshe Rabbeinu, when he comes to Paro, he tells him, look, God is going to bring a plague. What does he tell him? Why is God doing all this? So that you know that there is no one like me, like God, in the land. What does it mean in the land? In the land means that I actually engage with the world. God says, I'm not just in the sky, I'm not gone, I'm not too lofty for this world, but I'm involved and I'm engaged. Alternatively, in a different play, he says, so that you know that to God is the land, and God interacts with this world. And because it is so important to remember that God interacts with the world and God has providence. He acts within the world. He intercedes in worldly functions. We need to remember the miracles that God performed for us in Egypt and the Exodus. And that is why it is important enough that we wrap it on our arms every morning, and we put it on our doors. We put up a mezuzah. We mention it in davening and prayer multiple times a day to recognize that God intercedes in this world. And obviously the conclusion of that is that if God intercedes, God is also the one that sets up the rules of nature. And this is the conclusion of the Ramban, that most importantly, the message of remembering God's miracles is to remember that God performs everything, that God has created the world, he's created the laws of nature, and he will intercede occasionally. Now, obviously, this brings us to the category of hashgacha, of God's providence, God interceding in this world. And the question is, if God intercedes, how much does he intercede? How often does he intercede? What causes him to intercede? Is it the case that God monitors every predator as kill fest? Is God monitoring every lion stalking a group of zebras? Is he looking at every leaf that falls, every ant that walks? How finite, how specific is God's activity in the world, his providence? Or did he set up systems that on their own take care of these functions? Occasionally, God breaks a system to intercede, such as he did for us when we left Mitzrayim. But otherwise, the hashgacha, the providence, happens at the level of a klal, of a group. Or does hashgacha happen at the level of a prat, of very specific instances? In other words, when we view the functionality of the world, do we say that God looks at all the fish and he decides this year there's going to be 10 million pounds of salmon in the Columbia River? And then he created the system of nature, and nature takes its course. And some fish will be eaten, and some fish will be hunted, and some fish will grow and become mature and reproduce. The Ramban himself in this discussion points out that those that say there is no providence equate human beings to fish. Meaning, what the Ramban is telling you is that the Ramban's opinion is that fish actually do not have hashgacha pratis. They have hashgacha klalis. Every year, God decides how many fish there will be, roughly speaking, what the future of the fish species will be, and the rules of nature take their course. What does nature mean? Nature means the general laws of physics, the possibilities of chance, what we might call luck. So when you see a salmon jumping through the salmon ladders, it can be pure luck that he makes it to the top or he doesn't. And when you see one of those bears scooping out the salmon from the waterfall, no, it's just luck. Luck would have it. He's not part of the 10 million pounds that are going to survive this year. Now, it is the case that even if we posit the concept of hashgacha klolis, that God views things at a meta level, God is certainly aware of every specific instance, down to the bear catching a salmon at the waterfalls. Indeed, one of the Rambam's paradigms of faith is, I believe with complete faith, that the Creator knows all the deeds of men and their thoughts. He knows everything that human beings do, and he knows everything that happens and everything that occurs in the world. The question, though, is what level of interaction does God have with them? Is it at the level of a group, or is it at the level of specific? So as we've seen, as we'll continue to see, when it comes to animals, it seems the consensus is that God's interaction with animals is at the level of hashgacha klolos, meaning God looks at every species, decides whether the species will be successful or less successful, or it will peter out and die and come extinct. And nature takes its course and determines the specifics. The specifics are left to chance, luck. Now, as it pertains to human beings, the Chiduch explains almost all of the mitzvahs. And when it comes to the mitzvah of mitzvah, he has this explanation. So what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is a person that gets a leprous blemish. Mitzvah is a spiritual ailment. It's a spiritual affliction. It comes for committing one of 7 sins, typically associated with haughtiness, gaiva, person being too full of himself. Also lashon hara, gossip, and other sins. What's the idea of this mitzvah? The idea is that God will not let sin go unpunished. And that is an idea of hashgacha, that there's providence in the world. If a person sins, God will find their sins, and God will exact punishment from them. And that punishment comes in the form of leprosy. And the Chiduch points out that there are people that make a mistake. He does similar 3 groups to the Ramban. There are those that say there is no providence whatsoever. However, there are those that say providence extends also to animals, and a 3rd group that say providence extends to leaves and trees and physical objects without life in them. And the Chiduch says all these opinions are incorrect. What is correct is that individuals, human beings, they have divine providence. Animals, trees, inanimate objects do not.
What about the rocks or wanting to be underneath?
So that's a very good question. What about the rocks who wanted to be underneath Yaakov, Tzaddik? So that's a good question, but it doesn't indicate necessarily an act of providence. In other words, there's a question of how inanimate rocks would have some sort of feeling or desire. It's a good question, but it doesn't pertain to providence, which would be God's rules of rocks.
I guess the rock question is really, do the rocks have a nefesh?
Sort of a desire.
And if it has a nefesh, is that nefesh then, you have to bring it back to what we're talking about, is that nefesh then connected to a creator that can intercede with?
Right.
Which fish are
So,
there?
well, in terms of the creator interceding, the answer would be no. The question there is, can rocks have a desire? And then that's a good question. But in terms of providence, the answer is no. There is no providence to rocks. And rocks have a course of nature, and they follow, what you might predict. The laws of physics would give them, would provide for their future. However, when it comes to human beings, there's hashgacha pratis. God specifically plans every human being. He specifically engages and interacts with every person according to his merits. Now, what's interesting here is that this justification is used by many of the commentators to explain why human beings are allowed, and in many cases commanded, to consume animals. It's because because animals are left to the world of chance and nature. Animals obviously have no moral qualms with murdering other animals. The nature of animals is that there is no morality, and there's no divine providence. There's no culpability, no reward, and no punishment. However, human beings that merit divine providence, they merit to interact with God more directly, are therefore entitled to use the world of the animals and use the world of plants and inanimate objects for their own personal gain. It's a very interesting radak here. The radak says that hashgacha klolos pertains to animals, except when it involves human beings. So, for example, when there's a bloody fight in the Kruger National Park, that's hashgacha klolos. But when there's somebody who's in a Jeep who wants to watch it, now it's hashgacha pratis. Because now it's pertaining to a human being. It's pertaining to the guy who wants to watch it. You want to watch the festivity. Now it's up to God then, whether God will have your tour, witness a hunt or not. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And there's an interesting Rambam in the Guide to the Perplexed, Maranevuchem, that goes, he has another few theories about how hashgacha works. We'll go through them. And he has a very interesting explanation of why hashgacha pratis is specifically to human beings and how exactly that works. So the Rambam brings the theory of Epicurus, Greek philosopher, that there's no providence at all. It's turtles all the way down. The world is entirely chance and accident, and the world never had a moment of coming to being, and there's nothing that governs the world. There are no rules. Okay. The second theory is so now we're dealing with the theories that are, okay, so obviously there are serious questions with any theory that claims the world has infinite time. So Aristotle admitted that there was providence in the universe, in the creation of the universe. However, there's a second part of the universe, which is abandoned and left to chance. This is sort of the watchmaker theory that Aristotle subscribed to. Aristotle didn't differentiate between a stone falling and a ship with good men in it sinking. According to Aristotle, they were the same thing. There was no providence in one more than the other. They were all left to chance. Although it might be that the creation of the world was created by God, but once the world runs, there's no difference between an ox killing ants, by relieving itself, or the death of worshipers when a house's foundations give away. They're identical. They're both events of chance. The third theory the Rambam brings is the theory of the Mohammedan Ashariya. This is the theory of Sunni Islam, which is to the contrary. It's the exact opposite of Aristotelian theory. It's that everything is ordained by God. And the problem with this theory is that if every single thing is ordained by God, then what's left for human beings to do? You're also removing culpability, says the Ramban, because now everything is a matter of God's will. And where is the place for human beings to make a difference? In other words, the Ashariya position of Islam would be that every stone, every plant, every single living thing is all subject to hashgacha pratis, to specific providence.
Doesn't that also justify people act? Well, I guess
Now,
the creator wanted that.
Okay. So this is another. So very good. So now we get to another problem also, which is that you look at the world. There are clearly good people that are suffering for no reason of their own, right? You think of people that are born with severe defects, or born into terribly compromised situations, with very little choice of their own to be able to make a better life for themselves, to be responsible for their actions later in life. On the other hand, we also see people that rightly deserve the suffering accruing to them. Now, in the Mohammedan theory, it's sort of all divine will. God decrees it all. The fourth theory is what he calls the Mutzila theory. This is a theory of Eastern wisdom, Buddhism, and other Eastern scholars, which is that everything is about free will. In other words, everything is about reward and punishment. So every good deed is rewarded, every bad deed is punished. And obviously the conflict over here is, what about the fact that bad things happen to people that had no other possibility of avoiding them? So then the Rambam obviously brings his own theory, which is what he says is the opinion of the Torah, which is it's sort of a combination of the two, as follows. The more a person interacts with God, the more God's providence interacts with him. So the idea is hashgacha klaus, nature, chance, That is what you should think as of the default. If you're somebody who turns to God and interacts and relates to God, God interacts and relates with you. And therefore, you merit a form of providence that otherwise would not be there for you. So yes, there are rules of nature which declare for certainty that there will be events of tragedy that are impossible to control for, and is of the fault of no one. But it is also true that at the level that you interact with God, God will interact with you. There will be reward and there will be punishment. And generally speaking, to somebody who has at least a little bit of connection with God, there will be at least a little bit in all of his activity, a little bit of this balance between reward and punishment. He has some amount of divine providence that declares that things that happen to him are not chance and nature, but are providential and based on his own actions. And this is very important. You think about it, an event that happens in our lives, let's say in my life. You know, somebody wins the lottery. Is that divine providence or is that luck? And the answer is it depends. It depends, according to the Rambam. If he's somebody who is connected with God, it could very well be that this is an act of providence. God chose his ticket. And if not, it's an event of chance. Somebody's always going to win the lottery. And it might be you. And, we live in a world of chance. And therefore, until you move out of that world of chance by interacting and connecting with God, then you live within the realm of chance as well, the level of what we call hashgacha klals. It's interesting. The Ramban on Bereshis echoes the same idea, and he says by the Hasidim, these are people that put an extra effort to engage with God. We say lo yigurcha mitzadik einav. God does not ignore the plight of the righteous. If somebody is truly righteous, everything that happens to him is exclusively hashgacha pratis. A person who's completely righteous, bad things cannot happen unless it's deserving, and good things will not happen unless it's deserving. He gets exactly what he deserves because he's completely outside the world of chance. It's a very interesting thing. When the Jewish people go to war, so who's exempt from fighting? There's three types of people that are exempt from fighting. Somebody who built a house but didn't live in it. Somebody who married a woman but wasn't with her for a year. So you have the first year of marriage, you're exempt from fighting. And somebody who's planted a vineyard. What it means is he started a business and he's within the first year of his business. All these three people are exempt. They leave the battlefield. And then there's a fourth category. So what happens is the first three groups, they come to the draft office and they get exemption papers. Come back in a year. Everybody else gets drafted. They're all inducted now into the military. And before they go out to battle, the general comes and says, is there anybody here who's afraid of his sins? He's sinned too much. He's afraid that he'll be killed in battle. All of you are dismissed. You'll be in the Israeli military. They call it the jobnikers. This is in American. I think they call it the tail. The military is the teeth and the tail. The teeth are the people on the front line, and the tail is the supply chain. The people that ensure the military has a supply. So all the people that are afraid that they're too sinful, they all supply the military. They're not on the front lines. Who's in the front lines? Only people that are confident. They're confident that they're engaged with God. Ramban says to the extent that if these people are truly righteous, they don't need weapons to win the war. They'll win the war without weapons. Because if a person's truly a tzaddik, he's truly righteous, he only has hashgacha pratis. And God will only make sure that what happens to him rightly occurs. And these people have nothing to fear when they're on the battlefield. They will only get what they deserve. And similarly, the Ramban, also in Devarim, in another place, he says that if you're a regular person and you don't engage with God, so then you have nature, you have the world. The world runs. Sometimes you get good things, sometimes you don't. There's chance and luck. So let's review here. We began the discussion by pointing out that miracles occur to remind us that God sets the rules of nature, and God will intercede and change those rules occasionally. To remind us that God is the one who created the project and runs the project. As it pertains to providence, when exactly does God engage? When does he not engage? We saw from the Chinuch, the idea of Mitzvah is that God will engage with people. Men, human beings, humankind they merit divine providence. And that's why God will afflict them with a spiritual affliction if they mess up, if they engage in sinful behavior. We saw the Ramban, who clarifies for us that this is true of people that interact with God, people that have a relationship with God. To the extent that you acknowledge God's presence, he provides his providence. And to the extent that that's not true, to the extent that you're not engaged with God, then you're in the class of nature and chance, which is the explanation of why bad things happen to people that are certainly not culpable. This would be infant children that die. Think people that have zero culpability at all. Obviously, bad things will happen to good people because even good people have culpability at some level. And obviously, we're not ones to decide that, and that's a complicated question. But it is the case that bad things happen to even people that are absolutely perfect and never had any culpability at all, like an infant child. And the bad things happen to infants all the time. And the explanation is because nature is brutal, and sometimes we have to live with nature. But to the extent that a person's specifically engaged with God, then he can merit divine providence, that exactly what he's deserving of will occur to him. And we saw a similar idea in the Ramban. The soldiers that go out to battle, if they're confident that they're not sinful, they have nothing to be afraid of on the battlefront. They will get exactly what's deserving to them. And a regular person who isn't specifically engaging with God, they do not merit divine providence, certainly to that extent, and obviously to the extent that they talk to God, and to the extent that they interact with him, that will be the extent of their divine providence. Okay, questions?
How engaged with God this one has to be, and how do you know? You have to be like a prophet.
So that's a very good question. What I would say is that if I was there, I probably would know.
Right.
Well, the truth is that people that are perfectly righteous are incredibly rare to find. What?
Incredibly what?
Rare.
Oh, rare. Oh.
It's
Rabbi, can you repeat?
someone who's perfect. And the truth of the matter is that this is true throughout Chumash and throughout Tanakh. We find only a handful of people that were perfectly righteous. The Gemara says there were 7 people who never sinned. Now, there are a lot more than 7 characters in Chumash, right? Most of them, what? Yeah, sure.
They are.
Who are them? Binyamin, Yishai, the father of David. I think Avram is on the list. Avram Avinu is on the list. I can't remember the rest of them. I think Sarah Imenu is on it. Sarah Imenu, wife of Avram, is on it. Can't remember the list of all 7.
Oh, sorry.
We'll get to it. It's in the Sechtas Saita. We'll learn about it in about 2.5 months. Exactly. Gemara says there were 7 people that died because of the poison of the snake. In other words, the snake in the Garden of Eden that convinced Adam to eat from the tree.
Right.
That snake killed 7 people. Everybody else died because they deserved to die. So people that are perfectly righteous is incredibly unusual. Most people here are some sort of balance. And it's interesting, there's quite a genre of literature about Hashgacha Prata stories. And the truth of the matter is, it really depends on the person. There was an interesting story I was reading. There was a fellow who he had heart problems. He always used to keep his doctor's business card in his wallet. Anyway, one day he feels something's wrong with his stomach, with his heart. He feels like he's having a heart attack. So he immediately dials his doctor's phone number. Somebody picks up the phone. He says, "Can you transfer to the doctor?" So the person says, "Sure, just hang on a second, and I'll be with you in a minute." Okay, a minute later, the doctor picks up the phone, talks to him, and he says, "By the way, how did you know to call me here?" So he says, "What do you mean? This is your office number." He said, No, it's not my office number. I happen to be an emergency in somebody else's house. And I'm not in the office. Even my wife doesn't know where I am. Nobody knows where I am because I was called out for an emergency. So he says, I don't know, I dialed your office number. So he looks at the number and he realizes the number was 1 digit off his office number. And it happens to be that he was in that house at that time. Now, is this a story to be impressed with or not? The answer is it really depends on the protagonist of the story. When you look at somebody who's an upstanding person who talks to Hashem on a regular basis, he davens well, presumably it was divine providence. God arranged it so that he would miss a number on the phone. He pushed the wrong digit and happened to call the doctor on this. Otherwise, it could very well be a game of luck, especially in the time the story happened. His phone numbers were down to 4 digits really, because there was the area code, the 3 digits was a neighborhood, and then so it could be. It's not such a it's just only 1 in 10,000. It's still very common, but it's there is some sort of chance in the world.
Sure.
And the impression of these stories, I think it's important to recognize the people that were involved in the stories more than the story itself. Because the message of Hashgacha Pratis here is that to the extent a person is worthy of it, that's the extent he merits it.
How do we apply that like to the Parsha?
So how does it get back to the Parsha? So this week's Parsha is an example of the Jewish people truly being worthy of miracles. And this is an example where God's providence is out in the open for us. This is not some minor event of providence. This is a major providential event. And this is to teach us that God's providence is in the world, and God is the one who created the world and runs nature. And that's what we have to remember. In terms of our individual events that happen and providence that occurs to us, it's important for us to reckon our relationship with Hashem, and to the extent that to thank Hashem for giving us his providence and arranging life to work out the way it does. Okay, any other questions? Next week is the splitting of the sea, Parshas B'Shalach. The discussion will be about, it's a little bit of an extension of this subject. Divine providence is a little bit different when it comes to finding a mate, finding a marriage partner. Finding a marriage partner.
Wow.
No, I'm just introducing for next week. So Parshas B'Shalach, we'll talk about a little bit of an exception of divine providence. In other words, even a person who typically does not merit divine providence, in the case of a marriage partner, that's a little bit different, and that we'll discuss next week. Parshas B'Shalach. And the splitting of the sea, which is also compared to finding a marriage partner.